All right, thank you, Jennifer. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today to hear from our speakers. So this program is our annual Newell D. Goff Lecture. And this year, we're also commemorating the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. And it's also the RIHS's programming theme of Spotlight RI, celebrating the performing arts. And we're giving you a little bit of both tonight. Before I introduce our main speaker, we will begin with a special short presentation by our Deputy Executive Director of Collections and Interpretation, Richard Ring, who will highlight women in our portrait collection. And thank you, Rick, for putting this together for us tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm just going to be here for a little appetizer before the main event. And I just wanted to announce the launch within this past hour of our new online gallery of women's portraits. I'm going to share my screen so folks can see the online gallery here. And go. All right, and this is the wrong, there we go. We scroll down a little bit. These are all of our galleries, and then here we are on the portraits of women. So basically, we have nearly 700 paintings in the museum collection, most of them portraits, some landscapes, etc. But nearly 200 of the portraits are of women. But even for relatively elite white women, the challenge is finding information about these women themselves, not just about the men to whom they were attached. I want to thank our registrar, Dana Signy Monroe, for providing me with collections files, because it is in these notes, letters, and recorded family lore that we know that what we know about these women sometimes exists. If we want to support the rethinking and rewriting of American history to incorporate the silenced, etc., the galleries like this and the information we collect at the time of the gift are surely one of the ways which places like the Rhode Island Historical Society can contribute. So the first, I'm just going to cover 4 women from 3 centuries, almost 4 centuries. So just to give you a sense of the span of time. So first one, I wonder if, can everyone see this picture?
You might need to stop sharing and then reshare to click on the correct window.
Got it. Okay, figuring out the tech, which is always, how about that? Is that, yes?
I'm sorry, Rick, you're muted.
Wow. There? Am I good? I'm unmuted.
Yes.
Pardon me. So this is Anstis Jenkins Updike. The portrait of Anstis Jenkins Updike. This is the earliest American painting in our collection. So our earliest portrait, is of a woman. So that's fabulous. Nehemiah Partridge was the painter. He was a decorative painter of New York. It was probably painted in 1722, the year she was married. She's the daughter of Richard and Mary Jenkins of Bristol, Rhode Island. And somewhere up her family tree is Polish what am I saying? Royalty. Like, sort of a very, very famous families in Poland. Anyway, so she was actually the second wife of Daniel Updike. His first wife, Sarah Benedict, died in 1718. So Anstis was born in 1702, making her 20 years old at the time of this portrait was painted. Daniel was 28, and she had her son Ludwig 3 years later, and her daughter Mary 5 years later. She dies 22 years later, and the following year her husband remarries a third time, Mary Wanting. So again, we know very little about this woman, but she is our earliest portrait. Her husband, Daniel, was a successful lawyer, served as Attorney General, and the Updikes were a prominent Southern Rhode Island family for generations. But it's a fascinating, sort of first touchstone and a very interesting sort of enigma for researchers to dig into. All right, so I guess I have to stop sharing and reshare every time. I don't know if I'd have to do that, but I will try to do that now. So the next one is Mary Ide Wheaton. Okay. So Mary was born in 1790. So we're now almost in the 19th century. Not just a portrait, but a self-portrait. And so in terms of authentic voices, or in this case, authentic visions, this portrait is valuable as an expression of how the subject saw herself. Some of the most interesting information we have, as I said, on this woman comes from our archival, the letters that came with the gift. One of these letters was dated 1898. So this is long after this woman is dead, Mary is dead. But this was from Mary Ide Hunt Fuller to her niece, Helen, on the occasion of her niece's 21st birthday, in which she is giving her niece this portrait, okay, of her ancestor. So the 21st birthday, according to the aunt, ushers you fairly into womanhood. And she explains why she's giving her this painting. This painting was done by Mrs. Mary Ide Wheaton about the year 1812 at a school where music, painting, and embroidery were taught by a Miss Balch. The school was on George Street in Providence. Her maiden name was Mary Ide, daughter of Daniel and Sarah Buckland Ide. She was born in Seekonk, Massachusetts in 1790. Her father died when she was 8 months old. Her mother married your great-grandfather, Peter Hunt. So in 1798, your grandfather, Daniel Ide Hunt, was born, and you see, was named for his mother's first husband. It's hard to keep track of this, but you guys were friends. And so Mary Ide was only half-sister to your grandfather Hunt. They were in feeling just the same as if they had been full brother and sister, and he mourned greatly at her death and named me, this is the aunt, his firstborn for her, showing again his love for even her name. Although she died 20 years before I was born, and although my mother never saw her, yet she was held up as an example of all that was beautiful and womanly and worthy of imitation. It's very interesting how this concept of womanhood kind of develops throughout the 18th century and into the 19th century, and sometimes through these kinds of gifts even. Okay, so the next one, we have two portraits of this particular woman. It's not coming up. Hold on. Apologies for my, here we go. I think I have too many things open. And so I will simply close them. Yep. So Jen, I should have taken you up on your offer to advance the slides. Where is it? Oh my goodness. See, here it is on my desktop. Sorry. Share screen. I guess that's it. So that must be, so that's Candace Crawford, Alan Dorr, Carrington, Candace Carrington. This portrait, maybe I won't share the last one because we don't have time, but we have another portrait of her when she's older. She's 25 in this picture. This is in 1837. So Candace is the daughter of Sullivan and Lydia Dorr. She's the sixth of 7 children. She's the sister, younger sister, he's about 10 years older, of Thomas Wilson Dorr of the Dorr Rebellion. Candace marries Edward Carrington Jr., the second Edward Carrington. So the famous Edward Carrington is the one, by the time she marries Edward II here, in 1841, his father had become one of the great merchants of post-revolutionary Providence, who founded a fortune in the China trade and later on in cotton manufacturing. The fathers of the bride and groom had actually met in China. Edward Carrington had been sent to Canton in 1802 at the age of 27 with a letter of introduction to Sullivan Dorr, who was instructed to introduce the younger man to the Hong merchants and show him the ropes. So the records of this firm, by the way, form one of our largest and most important collections at Rhode Island Historical Society, the business papers. So back to the young couple, they live at 66 William Street, which had been the family home for nearly 30 years at that point, since the elder Edward had bought it in 1812. From census records, we also know who lived in the house. And so from just a little bit of data, and I'll just read one census from 1850, which is a couple years after they were married. We've got Edward, who's 37, Edward II. By this time, his dad is dead. We've got Candace, who's 34. And then we've got Loriana Carrington, who is Edward's mother. She's still alive at 74. We've got Anne, who is one of the children. She's 8. This is 1850, by the way. Then we have several African-American servants. So we've got George Waterman, who's about 40 from Connecticut. We've got John Smith, who's about 30 from Maryland. Samuel Hall, who's about 30 from Pennsylvania. Then we've got James Shea from Ireland, maybe a gardener. Then we have Mary Smith, another African-American woman from Maryland, and Anna Smith, perhaps her daughter, 17, Mary's 50. And then May Smith, 37, from Rhode Island. And then another Irish woman, Maria Gardner, probably, she's 22, and she's probably another domestic. So anyway, it's a very fascinating when the picture of the households that you can get from just from the census records are kind of tantalizing in their detail, but then their sort of suggestion of a larger story. And then the last woman I will talk about is actually from the 20th century. She was born in the 19th century, but really from the 20th century. And here we go. Oops, stop. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm seeing that. I will share it again.
I was gonna say it was up, you were good.
Okay, good. So this is Pearl Raphael Priest. So her dates are 1872 to 1944. So she's born in Detroit, Michigan. Pearl's family had originated in Hamburg. In 1897, she marries Samuel Priest, a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant she met when her family lived in Brooklyn. Samuel and Pearl found a mill in Cranston, and the family home was built in 1905 in Edgewood. In fact, you can go to 232 Norwood Avenue and stay at the Edgewood Manor Inn. That is their family home. Sam, as the mill workers called him, was one of the most prominent Jewish philanthropists in Rhode Island. Now, again, some of the most interesting information we have on Pearl comes from family lore, which came in with the gift. According to a letter in 2005 from her granddaughter, the donor's mother, to her son, the donor, Grammy Pearl played the piano. Liszt's Liebestraum was a favorite of hers. She carried a small dictionary with her to be able to learn new words. I think she was quite formidable to many, but Jerry and I adored her. Because we lived only a few blocks away from her Norwood Avenue house in Cranston, we would walk over there and ask her to tell us stories from her youth in Brooklyn and Fort Worth, Texas. They moved to Texas because of her mother's health. It must have been pretty raw there then. She said she saw her future husband as an apple-cheeked boy selling groceries in Brooklyn. So I like finishing with her because in 1928, 2 years after her husband Sam's death, Pearl Priest took over the mill that he had founded. According to the Providence Journal, quote, one of the few women in full charge of a large manufacturing plant. She also assumed the presidency of the Berry Spring Mineral Water Company in Pawtucket. Prominent for many years in civic and charitable activities in Providence and Cranston, Mrs. Priest lived in the Biltmore Hotel for the last several years of her life. So this concludes a little foray into the multiple portraits and some of the stories that you can kind of get into when you put these up for people. And I hope it's been interesting.
Thank you so much, Rick. And also I wanted to thank Dana for helping to get the portraits together and putting that gallery up. And I'm sure there are others in your department who are working on that as well. So that is really great. And if when you have a chance after the talk, everyone, please check out our online gallery. So now I'd like to introduce our main speaker, Dr. Claire Jerry. Dr. Jerry is a curator of political history at the National Museum of American History. She has worked at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History since 2016 and as a curator in the Division of Political and Military History. She specializes in political rhetoric, presidential history, and the history of women's suffrage. Jerry has also served as chief curator at McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina and guest curator at the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum. She holds a master's in public history from the University of Illinois in Springfield and a PhD in rhetoric and public address from the University of Kansas. Tonight, she will speak to us about the rhetoric suffragists used to gain the right to vote. The performative nature of rhetoric lends this presentation to fit our theme of performing arts. Our ability to work with Dr. Jerry and connect her with you tonight is in thanks to our affiliation with the Smithsonian. In addition to our affiliate benefits, we also received support from the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative tonight. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jerry, and thank you, Dr. Jerry, for taking time out of your night to be here with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Geraldine, and I will now start the adventure of trying to share my screen. Come on. And there we go. Well, thank you, Geraldine, for that kind introduction, and for everyone at the Rhode Island Historical Society and the Smithsonian Affiliate Program for making this evening possible. I certainly am delighted to be with you this evening and would have been delighted to have been with you in Rhode Island had that been possible. But wherever you are watching from, I hope that you were safe and well. Now, when Jennifer invited me to speak tonight, she said that a mention of Rhode Island would be appreciated. And I have discovered in my research that I agree with Thomas Higginson, a social reformer from Newport, who said at the first meeting of the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, "I do not blush at the smallness of my state, but I rejoice in its prominence in the movement." And so in the past months, I have learned a lot about the prominence of women's suffrage in your state, and I'm excited to be able to make more than just a brief mention of it. Now, as we've mentioned already, this is an anniversary year, and there's a lot to say about suffrage in the anniversary year of 2020. Now, my title suggests that I'm going to talk about words, but as a museum curator, I would also like to say as much as I can about suffrage using objects. So let's start with a few of my favorites from our collection. Maybe. This will be a long night if my notes don't. Here are 3 objects from our suffrage collection that I happen to like a lot. The first one that you see is a fan from the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Party. And it's a fan that I only recently saw for the first time in our collection. I'm delighted. I love this kind of suffrage memorabilia. And it was fortuitous because it gave me a nice Rhode Island object to share with you this evening. And as I understand it, we don't have a specific date, but it's somewhere in the 1913, 1915 range. In the middle of the slide, you'll see a portion of a banner that was used to picket the White House. Yes, the very first group to ever picket the White House was the National Woman's Party. They started picketing in January of 1917 and picketed for 11 months. Alice Paul saved this fragment of one of the most controversial banners. It was known as the Kaiser Wilson banner. Standing at the east gate of the White House on August 13th, 1917, the suffragists compared the President of the United States to our most reviled national enemy, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, because we were at that time in World War I. Well, let's just say that didn't go over very well with people passing them on the sidewalk. They were attacked, their banners were destroyed, they were arrested for obstruction of traffic. There wasn't anything else to arrest them for because it wasn't illegal at that time. And these silent sentinels, as they were called, were jailed and force-fed when they went on hunger strikes to demand their rights as political prisoners. The last object you see is a copy of the joint resolution for the 19th Amendment that passed in June of 1919, the first step in sending a constitutional amendment out to the states. And as we know, that process took over a year to complete until August of 1920. 3 certified copies of the joint resolution were presented to the National American Woman Suffrage Association, this one to the secretary, Helen Gardner. Okay, as you can already tell, I've got way too much planned for tonight. And if you let me talk about objects, we'll never get anywhere. We'll never get to words. Now, these are great objects, but they all focus on the end of the story. And there's a lot more to the suffrage story than that. So because Jennifer also suggested that I could go with what I find particularly interesting, we're going to focus on words. So maybe it's time for me to unpack a little bit of that self-disclosure, building on what Geraldine's told you about me. I started my professional life studying and teaching rhetoric and the history of public address, focusing on presidential campaigns and on various social movements. What that means is that I'm interested in persuasion. I'm interested in words. And so that's where we're going to go this evening. And some of the words we talk about will in fact be from Rhode Island. But first, why are words an important lens on the women's suffrage movement? Now, as Americans, we're often told that the ballot box is the best way to achieve change. But how do you do that when the ballot is the thing you're trying to get? And how do you get the ballot if you're denied the right to speak? This denial was a central element in women's oppression throughout history, but particularly in the 19th century. Now, something that the 20th century historians came to call the cult of true womanhood was an ideology in the 19th century that defined a woman in a way that contrasted pretty clearly with the ability to communicate in public. This ideology said that the ideal or true woman would first be pure. She would be retiring and modest. Now, as somebody who is right now engaging in public speaking, I'm sad to tell you that public speakers are, in contrast, aggressive, opinionated, and active. A true woman was also told that she should be pious and moral. A speaker, on the other hand, is competitive, ambitious, and maybe at best amoral. A true woman was told to be submissive, whereas a speaker is authoritative. And finally, the true woman was to be domestic, totally within the private sphere, whereas a public speaker is by definition public and is operating in a very different realm. Now, this definition sets up some interesting conflict because a submissive domestic woman would have seen that she had no business on the public platform. But a moral woman who cared about society just might think that was the place to be. So into this confusing context came suffragists with their words. So let's look at some of the ways in which suffragists used words. They used them in conventions, in speeches, and in newspapers. So starting with conventions. Now today, we typically think of organizations being formed first and their annual meeting or conferences coming later. Think about a professional organization that you may belong to or a philanthropic group that you support. But for women suffragists, the process was reversed. The meetings and conventions came first, and they were in some ways started as a substitute for the organizations that didn't exist. But once it became clear that the conventions were really popular and were working well, then the organizations soon followed. Suffragists found that these conventions served several purposes for them. First, it raised their morale. If you were someone in a small town who was interested in this topic, you might have thought you were the only person. You go to a convention and you find out there are a lot of women who are thinking the way that you think, and it makes you feel a lot better about how hard you're working for this. The conventions also increased commitment to the cause. You could get together with people and get excited. Think about the political conventions that we had this summer. People get together to get enthusiastic about what they're fighting for, and it worked for suffragists too. It also helped them create the very ideology of their movement. They would get together and debate, what do we stand for? What's our platform, if you will? How should we present that to the public? And finally, they discovered that the conventions introduced the movement into the public discourse. Now, this wasn't always a good thing, as we'll see in a minute, because sometimes the public media talked about the conventions in a way the suffragists might not have preferred. Now, the most famous of the conventions is probably the first one, the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848 that was co-organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She is shown in this photograph at about the same age that she would have been around the time of the Seneca Falls Convention. And this convention gave us both an iconic object and a lot of iconic words. The Declaration of Sentiments, the document produced for this convention, was written on this table that you see in the lower corner, which is a treasure of the Smithsonian. Now, the words in the middle are just a copy of the Declaration of Sentiments. As far as anyone knows, the original declaration has been lost to history. But writing on this table, Katie Stanton modeled their words on words that mattered to the nation as a whole, the Declaration of Independence. She used parallel words in parallel form, and she listed parallel grievances, things like violation of natural rights, obstacles for married women, religious discrimination, and individual obstacles such as denial of education, and in particular, the denial of suffrage. Now, several of the resolutions in the Declaration of Sentiments were related to the ability to use words. For example, resolved that insomuch as man does accord to woman moral superiority, it is preeminently his duty to encourage her to speak and teach as she has an opportunity in all religious assemblies. This next one I find particularly amusing. Resolved that the objection of indelicacy and impropriety, which is so often brought against a woman when she addresses a public audience, comes with very ill grace from those who encourage by their attendance her appearance on the stage, in the concert, or in the feats of the circus. If you're willing to listen to a woman sing or watch her act, then apparently you should also be willing to listen to her give a speech. And finally, resolved at being invested by their creator with the same capabilities and the same consciousness of responsibility, it is self-evidently woman's right to participate with her brother in teaching, in private and public, by writing, by speaking, and by any instrumentalities proper to be used in any assembly proper to be held. Those are pretty powerful words. Now, reaction to the convention, as I mentioned in the media, was less positive in the language used. The local press reported that it was an insurrection among petticoats. It was the most shocking and unnatural incident ever recorded in the history of womanity. Now, before we go on to look at some more conventions, permit me a sidebar about that object, the table. The table quickly became an icon for women suffragists and was taken and displayed at national conventions. It was presented to Susan B. Anthony on her 80th birthday in 1900. It took a little longer for it to get to Washington, D.C. When NASA offered the Smithsonian a portrait of Susan B. Anthony in 1918, it was met with a lukewarm reaction by the male museum officials. But 1 year later, after the amendment was sent to the states with that joint resolution we looked at, they came back. And now the male head of the department declared, there can be no question of the historical appointment of the movement initiated by Miss Anthony and now carried out to a successful ending. So the curator now agreed that the objects offered could come in if they were interesting. Now, the first group of material that arrived at the museum in late June included the table and some of the objects that you see here on it. And it was put into a display dedicated to the greatest bloodless revolution ever known. But it was only one part of the movement's story, not the confrontational part that I mentioned before that was at the beginning part of the Smithsonian's national narrative. But it was a start. Anthony's niece Lucy called it the crowning glory of everything. The good news now is that some of Alice Paul's artifacts have joined them. Think of that banner fragment we looked at earlier. This photo shows how the table was displayed in the museum in the 1920s. Today, it is part of our exhibit called American Democracy, A Great Leap of Faith. And the other objects that you see are in our new exhibit, curated by my colleague Lisa Kathleen Grady, called Creating Icons, How We Remember Women's Suffrage. So we love the table at the Smithsonian, but it was just the start of the convention story. National conventions started pretty quickly after Seneca Falls. By 1850, they were held every year up until 1860 with 1 year exception. And in 1902, the movement historians looked back to why had they started having meetings 50 years ago. And they said the purpose of the conventions was to agitate the question and create a favorable public sentiment. They were addressed by the ablest men and women of their time, and the discussions included the whole scope of women's wrongs, which in those days were many and grievous. I'd like to talk about two important figures from those early conventions. You see on the one side, in 1850, Paulina Wright Davis, who at that time was a new resident of Providence, Rhode Island. She organized the first national convention held in Worcester, Massachusetts. And again, the public press didn't use very nice words. They called it a hen convention, a hybrid, mongrel, piebald, crack-brained, pitiful, disgusting, and ridiculous assembly, a gathering of crazy old women. But the suffrage historians praised Davis, saying, to the energy and earnestness of Paulina Wright Davis, more than to any other one person, we may justly accord the success of the first conventions. That at those conventions, profound feeling pervaded the entire audience, and the talent displayed in the discussions, the eloquence of women who had never spoken before in public, surprised even those who expected the most. We'll see Paulina Wright Davis again in just a minute. On the other side, you see Sojourner Truth. In 1851, she spoke at a national convention held in Akron, Ohio, where she gave her famous "Aren't I a Woman" or "Ain't I a Woman" speech, where she argued that white men needed to take heed of the combined arguments of the enslaved people of the South and Northern women. I particularly like her conclusion. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back right and get it right side up again. And now that they are asking to do it, the men better let them. Now, from the late 1860s to the passage of the amendment in 1920, national conventions were held every year, and sometimes multiple conventions a year. There were different organizations, and there were even international conventions held in Washington, D.C. after the turn of the century. Speeches were a big part of the conventions, but there were other speeches that we should look at as well. At the national, first of all, let me talk about the obstacles that women encountered when they wanted to take the public platform. Opponents to women speaking had three basic rationales that they used. One they called the biological rationale. Women were too weak. Their brains were too small to participate in public, and certainly to speak. And how did we know this was true? Well, doctors said so. There was also the sociological rationale. Women's role in society was to raise children, not to do public things like sit on juries or go to meetings or give speeches. How do we know? Well, elected officials said so. And there was the theological rationale. Women were ordained to be quiet and submissive. How do we know? Ministers said so. Maybe even God said so. So they're up against some pretty heavy hitters in the cultural world. So the women who wanted to speak developed two lines of argument of their own. One was the expediency argument. If you give women the vote, good things will happen to society. Women can preserve morality at home and in society at large. Think temperance or the reduction of child labor, for example. But the other argument was called the natural rights argument. Women are human beings. And as human beings, they are also endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights among them. And so these were the arguments that they used to counter the arguments of their culture. Now, for the sake of time, I'm only going to introduce you to four of the most prominent speakers of the movement, recognizing that many people get left out of this list. At that first national convention in 1850, Lucy Stone, who you see here, was called a natural orator, with a silvery voice, a heart warm and glowing with youthful enthusiasm. Remember Thomas Higginson, our Rhode Island suffrage friend? He said this, "I remember going before the Rhode Island legislature once with Lucy Stone, and she unrolled her peculiar power, the wrong laws which exulted in that Commonwealth of Rhode Island in regard to women. After the hearing was over, the chairman of the committee, a judge who had served on it for many years, said to her, 'Mrs. Stone, all that you have stated this morning is true. And I am ashamed to think that I, who have been chair for 20 years of this Judiciary Committee, should have known in my secret heart that it was all true and should have done nothing to set these wrongs right until I was reminded of them by a woman. We're going to see Lucy Stone again in a minute as well. Here's one of our more famous speakers of the movement, Susan B. Anthony. Now, there are too many speeches by Susan B. Anthony to cover to do justice, so let's talk briefly about one of her most famous, the one that was tied to her decision to vote in the presidential election of 1872. Anthony registered to vote on November the 1st and voted on November the 5th. That day, she wrote to her friend Elizabeth, "Well, I have been and gone and done it. Positively voted this morning at 7 o'clock. Now, I hope that those of you who have not voted already are also planning to do that in just a few days. Now, a warrant was issued for Susan Anthony's arrest on November the 14th, charging her with voting in a federal election without a lawful right to vote. One of the commissioners of the U.S. Circuit Court sent word to her asking her to meet him in his office. She replied that she had no social acquaintance with him and she didn't wish to make a call. On November 18th, 4 days later, a deputy U.S. Marshal came to her house and said that the commissioner wanted to see her in his office. When she asked why, he said, "Well, he wants to arrest you." And Anthony said, "Well, this isn't the proper way. This isn't how men are arrested." And she insisted upon being arrested properly. The deputy then produced the warrant and arrested her, but when she held out her hands for the handcuffs, he absolutely declined to do that. Now, in between her arrest and her January trial, Anthony spoke in all 28 towns and villages of Monroe County, New York, asking in what has come to be known as the title of the speech, "Is it a crime for a U.S. citizen to vote?" Each speech lasted about 2 hours. I will not go that long tonight. And each speech was designed in no small part to influence the jury pool in her area. The New York Commercial Advertiser, reporting on the trial, said, "So convincing is Sister Anthony's rhetoric, it is supposed no jury can be found to convict her." The conclusion to Anthony's 2-hour speech was something like this: "The only question left to be settled now is, are women persons? And I hardly believe any of our opponents will have the hardihood to say they are not. Being persons, then, women are citizens, and no state has the right to make any law or enforce any old law that shall abridge their privileges or immunities." At her trial, the judge ordered she be found guilty without deliberation and fined her $100. She refused to pay in hopes that he would put her in jail. But had he put her in jail, she would have had grounds to appeal. So he refused to put her in jail, refused to collect the fine, and she was unable to take her case to higher court. Now, where Susan B. Anthony is found, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is never far behind. And it is also impossible to cover all of the speeches of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So I will focus on her last speech. We talked about her involvement at the beginning at Seneca Falls. Her last speech in 1892 was called The Solitude of Self, and it was considered her retirement speech. She gave it both to the House Judiciary Committee and to a national suffrage convention. It is a very atypical social movement speech. It does not promise that great things will be done if you pass what she's asking for. It doesn't say anybody's life will get better. It essentially says people are basically alone. And if you are alone, then each person should be empowered to be totally self-reliant. I think this speech is one of the most beautiful in the suffrage canon and possibly one of the most beautiful in all social movements in American history. Her conclusion went like this: "There is a solitude which each and every one of us has always carried with him, more inaccessible than the ice-cold mountains, more profound than the midnight sea, the solitude of self. Our inner being, which we call ourself, no eye can touch of man or angel has ever pierced. Such is individual life. Who, I ask you, can take, dare take on himself the rights, the duties, the responsibilities of another human soul?" Now, I think these examples show us some quite high quality rhetoric. But there was another measure of suffrage rhetoric: quantity. This is Anna Howard Shaw, who was the leading orator of the movement in the later period, say 1910 on. Carrie Chapman Catt said that Shaw was unchallenged as the greatest orator among the women the world has ever known. From 1881 to 1919, Shaw spoke in every state, gave several hundred speeches a year, sometimes as many as 8 a day. In 1915, she gave 204 speeches just in New York. And no surprise, she spoke in Rhode Island. And speaking of speaking in Rhode Island, let me introduce you to Alva Belmont. In 1910, Alva Belmont, a Rhode Island socialite, as I understand it, she was once married to a Vanderbilt, for example. Alva initiated the first attempt to integrate the suffrage movement in New York, working with leading club women in the African-American community, like S.J.S. Garnett, Mrs. F.R. Kaiser, Marie Lawton, and Irene Moorman. She encouraged them to form a branch of her Political Equality League. She established the first suffrage settlement house in Harlem, and she convened a conference of great women at Marble House in the summer of 1914. Now, in the same way that Marble House is now on the National Register, the property that Alva Belmont made available to the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C. is now part of the National Park Service and has recently been renamed the Belmont Hall Women's Equality National Monument. So these are words of conventions, these are words of speeches. We have one more set of words to go. Newspapers. Now, women readers had been instrumental in causing the increase in general circulation newspapers, but their issues weren't really covered. The content was not only not favorable to women, it was often antagonistic to the emerging women's rights movement, and it was particularly neglectful of women's speeches. So into this gap stepped a very large number of women's rights and suffrage newspapers, almost exclusively run totally by women. I want you to think about what that means for a minute. This is not just writing and editing, but this was the physical printing, folding, mailing, and managing their office. These were no small undertakings in the 19th century. There were no digital publishing apps. There was no Xerox machine. And for those of you who remember it, there weren't even mimeographs. We are talking about large home-style printing presses set up in women's parlors and women's cellars. The first volume of the History of Women's Suffrage in 1886 said, "If the proverb that the pen is mightier than the sword be true, women's skill in using this mightier weapon must soon change the destinies of the world." Well, women appeared to believe it because suffrage papers exploded. The first newspaper, which had women's rights as its sole subject, was published in Rhode Island by Anna Spencer, and it was called The Pioneer and Women's Advocate. And Spencer was recently inducted into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame. I haven't been able to learn a lot about this newspaper, so perhaps someone listening tonight will be able to help me out later. I do know that it began publication in 1852, and that its motto was liberty, truth, temperance, and equality. It advocated better education for women, a higher price for her labor, and the opening of new industries. But the more famous suffrage paper from Rhode Island is, at the time, it was called the first pronounced woman suffrage paper, was the Una, published by Paulina Wright Davis, starting in 1853. In her first issue, Davis said that this was her purpose: to speak clear, earnest words of truth and soberness in a spirit of kindness, to discuss the rights, duties, spheres, and destiny of woman fearlessly and fully. So far as our voice shall be heard, it will ever be on the side of freedom. We shall not confine ourselves to any locality, sex, sect, class, or caste, for we hold to the solidarity of the human race and believe if one member suffers, all suffer, and the highest made to atone for the lowest. Later on, Davis went on to describe the important work that all women publishers were doing. She who edits a journal has her daily, weekly, or monthly audience, and her mark is unmistakably made, whether she ever speaks of women's rights or otherwise. The very act of publishing was seen as proof that women were entitled to the rights that were denied them. Perhaps the first paper with a true national reach was the result of the first major suffrage campaign, a state referendum in Kansas in 1867. It lost by a vote of 21,000 to 9,000. After that loss, Anthony and Katie Stanton, whom you see here together, determined that what they needed was a newspaper. They said, our 3 most radical papers were closed against us. Thus ostracized, we decided to establish a paper of our own. In a letter to her friend Susan, Elizabeth proposed a name. She said, the establishing of woman on her rightful throne is the greatest revolution the world has ever known or ever will know. There is no name like the Revolution. The Revolution began publication in 1868. Although it only lasted 3 years, it introduced some controversy into the movement, and it was a financial burden on Anthony for a long time. The Revolution set down the major arguments in a national forum for the first time. It enhanced Katie Stanton's reputation as a writer, and it aroused more conservative women to respond and to act because of the radical nature of this paper. Some of those more conservative figures, excuse me, were Lucy Stone. Here you see her at a slightly older age, and her husband, Henry Blackwell. Their paper, The Woman's Journal, also included the words of experienced publishers William Lloyd Garrison, Julia Ward Howe, and Mary Livermore. The Woman's Journal was a more conservative paper, more narrowly focused, but it was the longest running paper of the movement from 1872 to 1931. And the wagon you see here was used to distribute and to sell copies of the Woman's Journal. It may not be our very best suffrage artifact, but it is our biggest. And it is also on display in our democracy exhibit. Now, my personal favorite of the suffrage papers was published by Clara Bewick Colby, The Woman's Tribune, which was the second longest running paper of the movement, published from 1883 to 1909. As an editor in what was then considered the West, Bewick Colby was in Nebraska, which doesn't seem like the West to us today. But she was particularly interested in creating an audience, in developing women's self-definition of women, helping women on the frontier understand that they could be part of this movement. She always aspired to national leadership, but she was never elected. But Bewick used her newspaper to align herself with Anthony and Katie, and eventually moved her paper east to Washington. She sought to do 3 things with the Tribune: educate her readers on many political and domestic topics, document the movement, providing both historical record and records of the conventions as they were happening, and promote herself as a role model of leadership. Now, some considered Bewick Colby's career a failure because she was never a leader herself. But rhetorically, she's a central figure in understanding the audience this movement was targeting and that she was trying to shape. Bewick Colby's career is also interesting because she represents the many ways in which one narrative, suffrage, can intersect with other narratives with other words. Bewick Colby understood that US issues were international issues, and she understood that women's rights were completely interwoven with the rights of others, and she used her paper to demonstrate that. She was a reformer's reformer. She advocated for dress reform, anti-vivisection, and temperance. She believed in Hawaii for the Hawaiians and in the Philippines for the Filipinos. She was the first woman's editor of a woman's newspaper to be awarded a war correspondence pass. She visited troops in Alabama during the Spanish-American War. At her core, a suffragist, Bewick Colby tried to address the totality of women's lives and the totality of citizens' lives, waiting for the day when women and citizen would not be oppositional terms. We have 1 copy of 1 issue of the Women's Tribune in our collection, and I'm always delighted when I have an excuse to go in and see it. A significant 20th century paper comes from Alice Paul, whom we've also spoken of. Now, Alice Paul was known more as an agitator. She did her persuading through other means, such as parades, processions, picketing, remember the banner? And she also symbolically burned the words of President Wilson. They put an urn on the sidewalk, threw copies of his speeches in them, and set them on fire. But Alice Paul was also a publisher. Her weekly paper, The Suffragist, was published from 1913 until 1920. In 1917, when the National Women's Party was picketing the White House, Paul wanted this paper to serve as the light to the public on the treatment of these women. And you see how she used images of the picketers on the cover of the paper. The newspaper did cast a light on that, but it ceased publication after the amendment passed in 1920. Now, the Woman's Journal and the Woman's Tribune were the national papers, but there were regional papers everywhere. In the Midwest, Helen Jackson Gauger published Our Herald in Indiana. Elizabeth Boynton Harbert published The New Era in Illinois. In the far west, Lula Green Richards published The Women's Exponent in Utah, and Abigail Stott Dunaway, The New Northwest in Oregon. Paulina Wright Davis had once said that being an editor was prima facie evidence that a woman had the right to speak. But Bewick Colby, who was herself an experienced speaker, said that for the undecided, newspapers were the best words. She said it this way: "The spoken word has its power for the day, but for the building up of a new line of thought in the popular heart, there must be the written word, which shall be quietly digested and made part of the reader's own thought. Then the change in belief comes irresistibly. While the lecture amuses and interests for an hour or two, the paper read in quiet moments builds up a faith that cannot be shaken." Shortly before her paper ceased publication, in 1905, Bewick Colby described what she hoped all of these suffrage words, from conventions, from speeches, and from newspapers, could achieve. And she said they should present an epitome of the best, whether in person or place, deed or words, to fight all forms of wrong by encouraging the good. Now, you might think it would be easy to end a talk about words, but it isn't really. There are so many words that I have left out. I have left out discussion of the debating guides that suffragists published for each other, or their uses of humor. I have not touched on their internal arguments, words that they used to talk to each other, or the words of frustration over waiting so many decades for an amendment that may or may not have accomplished what they hoped. And noticeably, and I will admit, unfortunately, I have not discussed the decision that was controversial in its own time and in ours for far too many leaders to engage in racialized rhetoric. First, very early in the movement, when Anthony and Stanton split with Frederick Douglass over the 15th Amendment, and at the last stages of the movement, when Carrie Chapman Catt was willing to tie suffrage to white supremacy in order to win ratification support from Southern states. Each of those topics deserves close attention, and I encourage you to learn more about them. You know, I should have known that picking a topic like words would give me too many words to talk about, because after all, this movement lasted 72 years. There were a lot of words shared on both sides in that time. So I will leave you tonight with my favorite suffrage quotation from Lida Calvert Obenchain of Kentucky. When asked why she wanted the vote, this is what she said: "If every reform advocated by every party could be carried into effect tomorrow, I would still be a woman suffragist. I want this thing because it is my own." Those are powerful words. They are contemporary words, and they are my last words. So I'm happy to hear some words from you now in the form of questions. So I'll stop sharing so I can see Jennifer or someone. Here we go.
All right, thank you so much for that, Claire. That's amazing. So for folks in the audience, feel free to add any questions into the chat field. Oh, we're getting some rounds of applause. Feel free to add the questions into the chat field, and I am happy to field a Q&A.
I just have to say that was so excellent. I
was.
don't have questions.
Well, I will say again how delighted I was to be invited to Rhode Island. I had not been in Rhode Island since I was a child, until the first time that Jennifer brought me up to the society. And because I am from the Midwest originally, and my research did target suffrage in the Midwest, it's really been eye-opening to learn about how much important suffrage history took place in your small state.
Yeah, thank you for that. So for context for everybody, Claire had come up in 2019 to do a talk for the Community College of Rhode Island. And I had gently asked at that point, could you just maybe include Rhode Island a little bit? And she did this great deep dive and really threw a lot of Rhode Island references in. So thank you so much for this. I am so impressed with the content that you were able to pull up. And as I think everybody saw, Geraldine had included a link to a recent essay by our librarian, Phoebe Bean, on the UNA. So it's nice to have that echo and that connection. I guess my own personal question, and Claire, you had mentioned this at the very end, could you talk a little bit extemporaneously about the idea of race in suffrage? Because I am really fascinated with that topic, and frankly, in 2020, I think it's pretty timely too.
It has probably been one of the most commonly discussed issues across the country in this anniversary year by museums and academics and by activists in the contemporary women's movement. And at the earliest stage, most of those very early suffragists, Anthony, Lucy Stone, Katie Stanton, were abolitionists. So they were actively involved. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott at the World Anti-Slavery Convention. And it's from that the Seneca Falls Convention came. And they were there and started talking about women's rights because the women had not been allowed to speak at the Anti-Slavery Convention in London. And so from the earliest, there was a lot of interest in both the issues facing abolition and the enslaved persons in the South, as well as women's rights. Where it started to become problematic was after the Civil War with the proposed passage of the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment enfranchised only African-American men, and it was the first time the word male was introduced into the United States Constitution. One side of the debate was represented by Frederick Douglass and Lucy Stone that said, we've got to push the 15th Amendment forward. This is the most important issue. What they said, it's the Negro's hour was their phrase of the time. And we will not forget women's suffrage, but we've got to go forward with this amendment. The more radical view was that expressed by Anthony and Katie Stanton, who said, no, we should not have anybody's suffrage until we have everybody's suffrage. And so in an effort to push their point, Anthony and Stanton, longtime abolitionists, engaged in some very ugly rhetoric about their fear of uneducated Black men, about formerly enslaved men having rights to vote that they didn't have. They said terrible things about immigrants as well. And so for the years right after the 15th Amendment, the movement blew up. People who had been friends formed separate organizations and sort of went their separate ways. It wasn't until the 1890s that the movement came back together and started to focus in more fighting for women's suffrage generally. Now, I want to say something about Frederick Douglass that I think is interesting. A lot of people have said, well, Douglass and Anthony and Katie Stanton couldn't get along. They didn't get along for a while, but his home is part of the National Park Service in the Anacostia neighborhood here in DC. And hanging in his home when he died, in his library, he hung a picture of Elizabeth Cady Stanton next to a picture of Abraham Lincoln. And in his upstairs bedroom, there's a picture of Susan B. Anthony. So there was some reconciliation before his death. It got worse again as we got closer to the amendment passing in the teens and up through 1920. Carrie Chapman Catt was desperate to get votes in southern states. And the fear was that southern states would not vote for suffrage because they would not want to give more voting rights to more African Americans, in this case women. And so she said, oh no, if you really want white supremacy, she really used that phrase, then you should support women's suffrage because there'll be more white women voting than there are African Americans. And then when you think that the history of the movement was largely written by friends and colleagues of Anthony and Katie Stanton, they wrote a lot of people out. They didn't talk in their history about Ida B. Wells Barnett or Frances Watkins Harper. They didn't talk about, later on, Alice Paul tried to get the African American suffragists to mark in the back of her parade. And Ida B. Wells Barnett famously said, I don't think so, and jumped into the middle of the parade and marched with her colleagues from Illinois. So it's a long, complicated, and unfortunately ugly history. And it features prominently in our current women's suffrage exhibit, where Lisa Kathleen argues that evidence to suggest that Anthony and Katie Stanton were any more or less racist than any other elite white people of their day, but they have to be held responsible for the language that they used. And they chose to use those arguments, even if they still believed strongly in equality for everyone. That was a long answer, but that's been the debate that's been all over the country this year.
No, I really appreciate that. Thank you. So I have a few more questions that came in. So a couple that came in privately. So it's a 1 and a 2, if you will. The first part, are you seeing any parallels between women's suffrage movement and some of the advocacy for expanded voting rights that we also unfortunately see today? That's part one. Part two, did women early on, after winning the right, also see suppression efforts?
Oh, well, I'll start with number two, and then I may have to remind me of number one. But
Okay.
certainly, African-American women experienced all the voter suppression that African-American experienced, and that suppression continued, of course, up through the Voting Rights Act and the kind of suppression that we're seeing today. I don't know that people have drawn a very close parallel, but specifically between suffrage and voter suppression. But what we have seen, and again, Lisa Kathleen argues this in her exhibit, is that, for example, in 1967, the International Year of the Woman, there was a major conference in Houston, and women did consciously compare themselves to the suffragists, use suffrage arguments. And in the 2017 March on Washington, I was out on the mall that day with Lise collecting, and I was delighted to collect from a woman was wearing a sash, just like a suffrage sash. And on one side it said 1848 to 2017, and on the other side it said still marching. And when I asked her about it, she later sent me a picture of her grandmother marching in a suffrage parade in Philadelphia. And she was marching for her grandmother in the 2017 March. So women who are politically active today definitely see that connection to the history in the past. What was the other thing I was supposed to answer?
Voter suppression, and then any parallels between the women's suffrage movement and advocacy for expanded voting rights that we unfortunately still see today?
I think that you can make parallels between all of the different voting rights efforts we've seen in the country, whether it's women's suffrage, African-American suffrage rights, including, say, the Selma March in the 60s. We make comparisons in our democracy exhibit to Asian American fights for suffrage, to Latinx fights for suffrage. And all of those immigrant and ethnic communities had suffragists. And a lot of effort is being put forward in the country today to try to put them back into the suffrage story, and then by extension, I think, back into the ongoing fight for voting rights.
All right, and I have one more question for you. If anybody else has any last lingering questions, throw them right into the chat field. But for you, Claire, what do you think was the most effective type of words out of the ones you've mentioned?
Well, I tend to be biased towards speeches, but I do think the newspapers were very effective because not only were they sold on a subscription basis, like any newspaper is, to their supporters. Bewick Colby, for example, took the main things out of the Tribune and published something she called the National Bulletin. It was like a little 4-page flyer, and they would go to county fairs or public markets and hand them out to people. It was a quick and easy way to get the word out to people who probably weren't going to conventions or might not be stopping on the street to listen to a suffrage speaker. I think the speeches were very effective in helping because the women went to the Judiciary Committee, they talked to their elected representatives, but the newspapers had a really vast reach because of the way that they could be produced. I was thinking while I was talking tonight, and I hadn't thought of this before, that it's almost like maybe the way people are using social media today, that we are using social media as a way to get a lot of our information out that we might have done in conversation or in meetings or something. So it was another way. So I think the newspapers were pretty effective.
That's really fascinating. Any last questions from folks? Final call. All right. I think that is it. Well, thank you so much for this evening, Claire. I've really enjoyed this. It was a fantastic talk. And I love always the Rhode Island references.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming out tonight.
Well, thank you for having me, and I hope I get to join all of you again someday.
Yes, we'll have to have
We
you
would
out.
love to have you back in Rhode Island.
That's great.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.